The air in the dimly lit office grew thick with tension as Mr. Wilson, Kola, and Vivian stood close, the reality of their predicament sinking in. The heavy wooden door remained stubbornly shut, and no amount of jiggling the handle had changed that. Wilson exhaled sharply, running a hand through his neatly trimmed hair. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while," he muttered, leaning against the desk. Vivian crossed her arms, watching him with a mix of amusement and unease. "So what now? We just wait until someone finds us?" He gave a small chuckle, the sound deep and rich. "Unless you have a secret lock-picking skill I don't know about." Vivian laughed softly, shaking her head. "Sorry to disappoint." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it was charged with something unspoken. Being in such close quarters made her hyper-aware of everything. The way his cologne lingered in the air, the way his gaze kept flickering to her lips before snapping away. Wilson cleared his throat. "You know, I never really noticed before." He hesitated, then smiled slightly. "You're incredibly beautiful, Vivian." Vivian's breath hitched. She had always been professional around him, always careful to keep things strictly business. But here, alone in the office, with no emails, no meetings, no distractions, there was nowhere to run from the attraction that had been building for months. Her eyes met his, searching. "Wilson, are you sure you want to say things like that?" His jaw tensed. "I don't think I've ever been more sure of anything." She swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "And what happens when that door opens?" His lips quirked into a half-smile. "We go back to being who we're supposed to be." Vivian let out a shaky breath, her fingers lightly brushing against his arm. "And until then?" Wilson's gaze darkened with something unreadable. "Until then." He reached up, his fingers grazing her cheek. "We just exist in this moment." Neither of them moved away. Neither of them stopped what was happening between them. The door was locked. And so were they, trapped in a space where the only thing keeping them apart was their own hesitation. The office was silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. It was already 1 a.m., and the air conditioning, which usually provided relief during the day, now made the room unbearably cold. Vivian shivered, rubbing her arms as a chill ran down her spine. She had tried to keep herself distracted, but the cold was becoming unbearable. Wilson noticed immediately. Without a word, he shrugged off his dark brown suit jacket and stepped toward her. "Here," he said, draping it over her shoulders. "You're freezing." Vivian hesitated for a moment before slipping her arms through the sleeves. It was warm. So warm. And the faint scent of his cologne wrapped around her like an invisible embrace. She pulled it tighter around herself, inhaling the lingering notes of cedarwood and spice. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Wilson gave a small nod, leaning against the desk once more. "It's nothing. I can't have my best assistant turning into an icicle." She let out a soft chuckle, but the truth of their situation quickly sobered her expression. "Wilson, what if no one comes to open the door?" He exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Tomorrow is a public holiday," he admitted, his deep voice laced with concern. "There's a chance we might be here. For a while." Vivian swallowed hard. The thought of spending the entire night, and possibly the next day, alone with him, sent her heart into a nervous rhythm. It was one thing to be stuck for a few hours, but a whole day? Wilson noticed the worry on her face. "Hey," he said gently, "we'll be fine. Worst case, we find something to use as a blanket and sleep here." She let out a soft sigh. "It's just, I didn't expect to spend my night locked in an office with my boss." Wilson smirked. "Could be worse." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Really? How?" He pretended to think for a moment. "You could be stuck here with Mr. Adams from accounting. I hear he snores like a bear." Vivian burst into laughter, shaking her head. "Okay, you have a point." Their laughter faded, and once again, silence filled the room. But this time, it felt different. The cold still lingered, but with his jacket wrapped around her and his presence so close, she no longer felt frozen. Wilson watched her carefully, his gaze softer than before. "You should rest," he said. "It's going to be a long night." Vivian hesitated, then finally nodded. She sat down on the small couch in the corner of the office, pulling the jacket closer. "Good night, Wilson." "Good night, Vivian," he replied, his voice quiet. As she closed her eyes, she couldn't ignore the warmth lingering on her skin, not from the jacket, but from the man who had given it to her. "Just to support us kindly, don't skip the ads on our stories. Let them play to the end. That way you are motivating us to create more romantic stories, just like this one." The first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the office windows, casting a golden glow over the room. Vivian stirred, slowly opening her eyes to find herself still curled up on the couch, Wilson's warm jacket wrapped tightly around her. For a moment she forgot where she was, until she saw Wilson sitting at his desk, staring out of the window, deep in thought. "Morning," she murmured, stretching slightly. Wilson turned to her, a small, tired smile on his face. "Morning. Sleep well?" Vivian sighed. "As well as one can on an office couch." She sat up, running a hand through her braids. "Any sign of someone coming to open the door?" Wilson shook his head. "Not yet. It's a public holiday. I doubt anyone's in a hurry to come in." Vivian groaned, frustration creeping into her voice. "So what do we do? Just sit here and wait?" A thoughtful look crossed her face, and suddenly an idea struck her. "What if we write a note and throw it out the window?" she suggested. "Maybe one of the security officers or someone walking outside will see it." Wilson raised an eyebrow. "That's actually not a bad idea." Vivian grinned. "See? I'm more than just a pretty assistant." Wilson chuckled, shaking his head. "I never doubted that." He grabbed a sheet of company letterhead paper and a pen, quickly scribbling down a message. "Help. We are trapped inside Wilson Kola's office on the 6th floor. The door is locked, and no one is around. If you find this, please alert security." Wilson and Vivian folded the note neatly and looked around. "We need something heavy enough to make sure it doesn't just float away." Wilson scanned the office before grabbing a small paperweight from his desk. "This should do." He wrapped the note around it, securing it with a rubber band. They both walked to the window, looking down at the quiet streets below. "Ready?" Wilson asked. Vivian nodded. "Let's hope this works." With that, Wilson tossed the weighted note out the window, watching as it tumbled down toward the ground. Now, all they could do was wait, and hope someone noticed it before the day was over. Vivian leaned against the desk, staring out the window as the note disappeared into the distance. The silence between her and Wilson grew heavier with each passing second. Would someone see it? Would they be stuck here the entire day? She let out a deep sigh, her fingers idly tracing the edge of a file on the desk. Wilson, standing beside her, ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "I hope that works," he murmured. Vivian glanced at him, noticing the way the morning light softened his sharp features. For the first time, she truly took in how handsome he was, not just in the intimidating, powerful way she always saw at work, but in a more natural way. "We should keep an eye outside," she said, attempting to shake off the strange feeling creeping into her chest, "just in case someone picks it up." Wilson nodded, stepping closer to the window beside her, but as he did, his hand accidentally brushed against hers. Vivian felt a jolt, a strange warmth spreading through her at the simple contact. She turned to him instinctively, her breath hitching as she realized just how close they were. Wilson hadn't moved away. Instead, he was watching her, his dark eyes unreadable. The space between them was so small now that she could feel his breath against her skin. Her heart pounded. Was it the tension of the situation? The fact that they had spent the entire night together locked away from the rest of the world? Or was it something more? Wilson's gaze flickered down to her lips for just a second, a split second too long. Vivian's breath caught, her lips parting slightly. She wasn't sure who leaned in first. Their faces inched closer, the warmth between them magnetic, undeniable. The world outside, the locked door, the waiting. It all faded as Wilson's hand lightly brushed against her waist, his touch hesitant but firm. Vivian's eyes fluttered shut, her heart racing. But just as their lips were about to touch, a loud knock sounded on the office door. They both jerked back instantly, as if a spell had been broken. Vivian's breath was shaky, her face flushed. Wilson cleared his throat, stepping away quickly, running a hand through his hair. The knock came again. "Mr. Kola? Vivian, are you inside?" a voice called. Vivian swallowed hard, pressing a hand to her chest to calm her racing heart. "Looks like someone saw the note," she whispered. Wilson nodded, avoiding her gaze. "Yeah, looks like it." They were about to be rescued, but something in the air between them had already changed forever. Wilson took a deep breath, running a hand down his face as he stepped toward the door. Vivian, still flustered, tucked a loose braid behind her ear, trying to steady herself. Had they really almost kissed? Another loud knock came, followed by the voice of the security officer. "Mr. Kola, Miss Vivian, are you inside?" Wilson cleared his throat, trying to sound normal. "Yes, we're here. The door is locked from outside." There was a shuffling sound, then the metallic clinking of keys. A moment later, the lock clicked, and the heavy office door swung open. A tall security officer in a dark uniform stepped in, frowning. "We found the note outside this morning. What happened? How did you two get locked in?" Vivian quickly grabbed her purse from the desk, eager to break the tension. "It's a long story," she said, forcing a small laugh. "Let's just say, next time, we'll make sure we don't stay late when there's a public holiday." Wilson gave the officer a nod. "Thanks for coming. We really appreciate it." "No problem, sir." The officer gestured toward the hallway. "You're free now." Vivian walked ahead, but as she reached the door, she felt Wilson's hand lightly touch her lower back. A small, barely noticeable gesture, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. She didn't look back. She couldn't. As they stepped into the elevator, the air was thick with unspoken words. Wilson leaned against the mirrored wall, his arms crossed. "Well, that was an experience," he said lightly, though his voice had a strange edge to it. Vivian nodded, staring at the glowing elevator buttons. "Yeah, a long night." Silence stretched between them. Not the usual comfortable silence of a boss and his assistant, but something else entirely. She could still feel the warmth of his hand from earlier, the way his eyes had darkened when they were just inches apart. Wilson suddenly let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "We almost kissed, didn't we?" Vivian's breath caught. She turned to face him, eyes wide. He said it out loud. A nervous laugh escaped her lips. I don't know what you're talking about," Wilson smirked. "Oh, you do." The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open, flooding them with morning light from the lobby. The moment was gone. Vivian swallowed, stepping out quickly. "I need to get home. I'll see you after the holiday, Mr. Kola." Wilson watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he gave her a small nod. "See you soon, Vivian." As she walked away, she felt his eyes lingering on her, and deep down, she knew things between them would never be the same again. Vivian walked into the office, feeling strangely nervous. It had only been a day since the incident, but everything felt different. The way she saw Wilson, the way she felt when she thought about him. She had spent the entire holiday trying to convince herself that nothing had changed, but deep down, she knew that was a lie. As she placed her bag on her desk and powered on her computer, she heard his voice behind her. "Vivian." She turned, her breath catching as she saw Wilson standing at his office door, his expression unreadable. "Can you come in for a minute?" Her heart pounded. "Sure." She followed him into his office, and he shut the door behind her, something he rarely did unless it was a private matter. For a moment, he just stood there, as if searching for the right words. Then, with a deep sigh, he ran a hand through his hair and looked at her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "I need to tell you something," he said. Vivian forced a small smile, trying to keep things light. "Is this about the night we were locked in? Because It's about more than that," he interrupted gently. Her smile faded. "Oh." Wilson stepped closer, his voice lower, more serious. "Vivian, I've been trying to ignore this for a long time, but after that night, I realized something. Life is too short to hold on to feelings and do nothing about them." She felt her stomach flip. "Feelings," she whispered. His gaze held hers. "I have feelings for you, Vivian. I've had them for a while now. I just never had the courage to say it." Vivian's breath hitched. This was not happening. Wilson Kola, the man she had worked for all this time, the man who was always so controlled, so composed, was confessing his feelings for her. "But why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wilson let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Because when we were trapped in that office, sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to find us, I kept thinking about what I would regret if something worse had happened, and the biggest regret would have been never telling you how I feel." Vivian couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clenched them into fists to steady herself. This was too much. This was everything. She should say something. She should respond. But all she could do was stare at him, her heart racing, as Wilson took another small step closer, waiting for her answer. For a long moment, Vivian didn't say a word. She just stared at Wilson, her mind racing. She had imagined something like this before, but always in fleeting, impossible daydreams, never in reality. But now, here he was, standing before her, vulnerable in a way she had never seen him before. And the truth was, she felt the same way. A soft smile played on her lips as she took a slow step toward him. "Wilson, She hesitated, then let out a breath. "I think I've always felt something too. But I was scared." His eyes softened. "Scared of what?" She bit her lip. "That it would ruin everything. That maybe you didn't see me that way." Wilson chuckled lightly. "Vivian, I've always seen you that way. I just convinced myself it was wrong." Vivian's heart pounded. This was real. It was happening. She looked up at him, a little teasing glint in her eyes. "So, what now, boss?" Wilson smirked. "First, stop calling me boss when we're alone." She laughed. "Fine. Wilson." A comfortable silence settled between them. Then, Wilson gently reached for her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. "I don't want to rush this," he said softly. "I want to do things right. With you." Vivian's smile widened. "Me too." The next few weeks at the office were different. Vivian and Wilson had always worked well together, but now, there was an undeniable energy between them. Wilson would steal small glances at her during meetings, and Vivian would pretend not to notice. But she always did. One afternoon, as she walked into his office with a file, he reached for it, but instead of taking the document, he brushed his fingers against hers, just enough to send shivers up her spine. Vivian cleared her throat, pulling her hand away. "You did that on purpose," she accused playfully. Wilson smirked. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Another day, while working late, Wilson walked over to her desk and leaned in slightly. "Are you hungry?" Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering to get me food?" "Of course," he said smoothly. "A good boyfriend takes care of his woman." Vivian almost choked on her own breath. "Boyfriend?" Wilson grinned, leaning closer. "Unless you'd like another title." She rolled her eyes but couldn't fight the warm blush creeping onto her cheeks. It was new, it was exciting, and most of all, it felt right. But deep down, they both knew this was just the beginning. Vivian swallowed her bite of food, noticing how serious Wilson had suddenly become. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting her fork down. Wilson exhaled and leaned forward. "I've been thinking..." About us. Vivian's heart skipped a beat. And? He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing against her skin. I don't want to hide this. I don't want to pretend like what we have isn't real. Vivian blinked. Are you saying? I want us to be together. Officially, Wilson said, squeezing her hand gently. No more pretending in the office. No more holding back because of what people might say. Vivian felt a rush of emotions. Excitement, nervousness, but most of all, happiness. I want that too, she admitted, her voice soft but sure. But what about work? What about the company? Wilson smiled. We'll figure it out. I'm not letting corporate rules stand in the way of the best thing that's ever happened to me. Vivian blushed, looking down, but Wilson lifted her chin. Say it, he murmured. She took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto his. I love you, Wilson. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. I love you too, Vivian. A week later, Wilson gathered all the employees in the office for an announcement. Vivian stood nervously at his side. I want to thank everyone for their hard work, he began, glancing at Vivian. And I also want to be transparent about something. Vivian and we're together. A murmur went through the crowd, but before anyone could say anything, Wilson continued. I know workplace relationships can be tricky, but I want to assure you all that our professional roles remain unchanged. Vivian is an incredible employee, and I will continue to respect her as a professional, just as I hope you all will respect our decision. Silence. Then, unexpectedly, applause. Vivian let out a relieved laugh as a few colleagues smiled and nodded approvingly. After the meeting, Wilson pulled her aside. See? Nothing to be afraid of. Vivian rolled her eyes playfully. You always think you're right, don't you? He smirked. Only when it comes to you. She shook her head but couldn't hide her smile. Over the next few months, Wilson and Vivian's relationship blossomed. They navigated the challenges of balancing love and work, but with open communication and unwavering trust, they made it work. One evening, after a romantic dinner, Wilson took Vivian's hand as they walked by the beach. I have one more thing to say, he murmured, reaching into his pocket. Vivian's eyes widened as he got down on one knee. Vivian, from the moment we got locked in that office together, I knew you were the one. You challenge me, you inspire me, and you make my life complete. Will you marry me? Tears welled in Vivian's eyes as she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. Wilson slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into a deep, loving kiss. It had all started with a locked door. Now, a new door to their future had just opened. The end. Thank you so much for watching. Have a blessed day.